Good morning, everybody. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for this morning, Lord God. Thank you just for everything, Lord, that we can gather here and listen to your word, Lord. And this is important, Father. And Lord, we just give you all the praise and the glory in these things that goes on in our lives. May it be good or may it be evil, Lord. It's all in your purpose, Lord, for we love you, Lord. And we just give you all the praise again, Lord, in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Joseph the deliverer. Now, as we go through the 5 books of Moses, it's important to always keep in mind the Abrahamic covenant. It was to Abraham that God promised he would increase his descendants and make them into a great nation. That he would bless Abraham and make his name great, and Abraham would become a blessing to his descendants, and then to all the families of the earth. The book of Genesis traces the partial fulfillment of these promises through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's sons. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's sons. It is through Joseph that we see the partial fulfillment of blessing the nations during the famine that was going on this time. Joseph's role in relation to the Abrahamic covenant is a bridge between the covenant promises of God to Abraham and the fulfillment seen in the book of Exodus. God's promises to Abraham are carried out through his descendants, even in the face of much adversity, as we see in Joseph's life. The narrative of Joseph spans from chapter 37 to chapter 50 in the book of Genesis. It is in these chapters we see how Jacob and the family ended up in Egypt. Now, the covenantal promise of blessing on Abraham's descendants is surely seen on Joseph's life. Joseph grew up hearing and learning of the covenant in his family, and he believes in the covenant given to his great-grandfather Abraham. This is clearly evident by his words in Genesis chapter 50, verse 24 and 25. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land unto the land which he sware to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. Joseph believes in the covenant promise of the land, and Joseph's life was all in the purposes of God to ensure the survival of Abraham's descendants and to fulfill the promises to bless Abraham's descendants. To understand verse 1 of chapter 45, where we'll be at, we need to remember Joseph has tested his brothers with a silver cup in order to see if they would abandon Benjamin, Joseph's youngest brother. After the brothers are brought back, it is Judah's plea to Joseph, who's still unknown to the brothers, that brings Joseph to reveal himself to them. For Joseph to hear from Judah of how his father grieved for him, and hear how he would grieve for his brother Benjamin if anything would happen to him, to hearing Judah express his willingness to give his life for his brother Benjamin. This had to move Joseph. It does not take much imagination to feel the deep emotion that Judah's words were created in Joseph. Thereby, Joseph cannot hold back any longer. Genesis chapter 45, verse 1 and 2. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him. And he cried, Cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. Joseph could not refrain or control himself before all them that stood by him. The them is the Egyptian guards, the servants and officials who were present with Joseph. We could say Joseph's royal entourage. Joseph sends all of them from the room. Joseph is alone with his brothers and makes himself known to them. We can be sure when Joseph revealed his identity, his brothers in all likelihood just stood there at first just stunned by the turn of events. It appears that Joseph began weeping as he revealed himself to them. Joseph's weeping was so loud that he could be heard outside of his house. The news of Joseph's weeping would have quickly spread even to the house of Pharaoh. It must have been quite unnerving for the brothers to hear that not only that he was Joseph, but that the second to the king of Egypt was weeping loud enough that the Egyptians that he dismissed from the room could hear him. The nervousness would have suddenly turned to utter fear for their lives. And then in verse 3 and 4, and Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Does my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. The words, I am Joseph, is spoken in Hebrew. And it's the last thing the brothers ever expected to hear. Just these three words would have struck fear in their hearts. Immediately they would have thought, this is the brother they betrayed. This is the brother whom they meant to murder, but instead sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph also says to them, Does my father yet live? Joseph has asked this before of them in the other chapters, but in this instance, it seems Joseph only wants to know if Jacob is really alive. It is the foremost question on his mind after not seeing his father for years. Then we are told his brethren could not answer him because they were troubled at his presence. They were in shock, basically, not just troubled. The idea of punishment from Joseph would have overtaken them quickly. The statement by Joseph, Come near to me, I pray you, implies that the brothers stood back in fear. Joseph is not demanding them to come near. He's asking them to please come near. The brothers respond by coming closer, not because that puts them at ease. It is because they know he has a great authority and that they could be put to death at any moment. When they draw near to Joseph, he again iterates, I am Joseph, your brother, whom ye sold into Egypt. Again, fear would have gripped them. Then in verse 5, Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. There are no words of condemnation from Joseph here. The intention here is to calm the brothers' fears. Joseph is telling them not to beat themselves up. He tells them neither grieve or be angry with themselves that they had sold him. When did Joseph reach this stage of forgiveness? It's hard to say, but that is exactly what is going on here. Joseph has forgiven them. He is past his grief and anger, and he wants them to do the same. Then Joseph gives them the reason why. For God did send me before you to preserve life. How is Joseph, who had the power in his hands to do whatever he willed with them, able to forget or forgive so completely? The answer is in what he said about God. Joseph's view is God's view. He did not whitewash what the brothers did. There was need of repentance from his brethren. Nevertheless, Joseph points to the grace, sovereignty, and the wisdom of God. He understands that God's purpose was greater than the evil that was done to him. Despite the suffering and betrayal as he endured, Joseph chose to extend compassion to his brethren. Joseph's actions is a powerful picture of Christ in forgiveness and reconciliation. What did Christ say on the cross? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Luke chapter 23, verse 34. God sent his only begotten Son to preserve life. Then in verses 6 and 7, for these 2 years has the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years, in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. Joseph tells them what to expect in the future. They knew that there had been 2 years' drought where there had been no crops. But Joseph knew that there would be another 5 years of famine, and told them so. But again, Joseph reiterates, God sent me before you. This time Joseph offers an additional reason to preserve you a posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. By the providence of God, through Joseph, the 12 tribes of Israel's posterity or descendants were preserved, which provided the conditions for it to become a nation. Joseph is the deliverer, but it is God who is the ultimate deliverer. God sent Joseph ahead to preserve the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now God has varied and complex reasons why he allows famines. We see these through the Bible. But one reason here is to send Israel into bondage. They came to Egypt because of the famine. If there had been no famine, they probably would have never came. God, in his wisdom, separated them from the land of Canaan, while the iniquities of the Amorites ran its course. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, the Lord told Abraham, but in the 4th generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. The Israelites needed to be separated from the peoples of the land of Canaan, just as Lot and his family needed to be separated from Sodom and Gomorrah. Though they were in slavery, God used their bondage to multiply a people to him. The application for us is we may complain and rail against what has happened to us in this life, but it is God who's in control. He guides the events, and his plans will prevail. Joseph clearly understood this, that all the good and evil led him to this point in God's plan for his life. And then in verse 8, so now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Again, Joseph says that God sent him here, not them or anyone else. It is God who guided his life, not circumstances, not fate, but God. God who's in control and who tells us. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Joseph was called according to God's purpose. And in Joseph's life, we clearly see he put God first. To put God first is to love God. It's unclear what Joseph meant by the phrase "a father to Pharaoh," but in all probability, it means he was an advisor or teacher to Pharaoh. It seems to refer to an ancient Egyptian office called a Grand Vizier. I think that's how you pronounce it, which was the highest administrative official who served the Pharaoh. Joseph would have been in charge, in other words, the whole bureaucracy of Egypt. To be Lord of all his house means Joseph managed Pharaoh's household. To be a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt fits the description of the grand vizier. Joseph's position was only second to the Pharaoh himself. In all of this, Joseph is not bragging. He is simply saying it was God who did this. It is through Joseph God blesses the nations around Egypt during the famine. Joseph prefigures a greater Joseph who will establish God's kingdom on earth. And then in verse 9, haste ye, and go up to my father, and say unto him, Thus saith thy son Joseph, God hath made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down unto me, tarry not. Joseph does not ask his brothers, he commands them, all of them, to hurry and go and get Jacob, and commands them to repeat the message that Jacob's son had been made Lord of all Egypt by God, and to come now, do not wait. Why would Joseph tell them to say, God hath made me Lord of all Egypt? Because it would remind Jacob of Joseph's dreams. The statement would give proof that Joseph was alive. Excuse me. These commands in verse 9 are powerful in the sense that God had given the land of Canaan to the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now Jacob and his sons are commanded to come to Egypt. Both Abraham and Isaac were told not to go to Egypt. In the case of Abraham, he was told not to go due to a famine. Isaac also during a famine was told not to go. And the Lord appeared unto him and said, Go not down into Egypt. Dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. Genesis chapter 26, verse 2. In contrast, Jacob, who faces a similar situation, is told by God to fear not to go down into Egypt. Jacob's fear probably stemmed from his father and his grandfather's experience here. And then verses 10 through 13, And thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen, and thou shalt be near unto me, thou and thy children, and thy children's children, and thy flocks, and thy herds, and all that thou hast. And there will I nourish thee, for yet there are 5 years of famine, lest thou and thy household and all that thou hast come to poverty. And behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin, that it is my mouth that speaketh unto you. And ye shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and of all that ye have seen, and ye shall haste and bring down my father hither. The message to be given to Jacob continues here. The land of Goshen was probably in northeastern Egypt in the Nile Delta. It was a fertile area of grazing. This is the place where God, through Joseph, would nourish them during the famine. This is where the Hebrews would stay for 400 years. When we read verse 12, remember, Joseph was no longer using an interpreter. He was speaking in the Hebrew language, and that was proof also that he was their brother. Joseph then asked his brothers to tell Jacob all of that they have seen. Joseph wants them to take it all in other words, his authority, his power, his wealth, and the respect that is afforded to Joseph. The 2 dreams that Joseph had as a young man had now come true. Jacob had interpreted these dreams as prophetic, though he was not sure of them. But now the purpose of telling Joseph's renown is not for Joseph's glorification, but to convince Jacob that Joseph possesses the authority and power to carry out what he said he would do. In all of this, Joseph is seen as a type of Christ. The reconciliation of Joseph's brethren reflects Christ's role in reconciling mankind. And Joseph's authority, honor, and glory is also a reflection of Christ's honor and glory. Even in Joseph's provision of food and security during the famine is a type of salvation and spiritual provision that the Lord Jesus Christ offers to us. And then in verse 14 and 15, and he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept upon his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. And after that, his brethren talked with him. At this point, Joseph fell upon or embraced Benjamin, his full brother, and he wept. We can be sure Joseph felt closest to Benjamin, his brother, by the same mother, Rachel. Both of them wept, probably over the lost years between them as brothers. Then Joseph kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. These actions of reconciliation would have set at ease, to a certain extent, Joseph's brethren. It broke the ice, so to speak, that led to a more open conversation between them and Joseph. Joseph's actions can be seen as a reality of his forgiveness toward his brethren. None of this must have been easy for Joseph. It would have been easier, especially in his position, to just throw them in the dungeon and forget all about it. But Joseph let God change his heart. Was it instantaneous? I doubt it. It was more of a process of letting God work in his life that he could come to forgiveness. When we read the story of Joseph, there were many things he could have been bitter about. But in all of them, he followed God and let God change his heart to the glory of God. And then in verse 16, and the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brethren are come. And it pleased Pharaoh well and his servants. Until now, no one really knew what was going on with 11 strangers that Joseph was alone with and talking to. But somehow the news of Joseph's brethren had come to Egypt was carried to the Pharaoh's house. Not only did this please the Pharaoh, but his servants as well. The reason it pleased them was probably because Joseph had saved the Egyptians from the famine, and they respected and appreciated Joseph. All that Joseph had done has been good, so it makes sense the Pharaoh and the Egyptians would be in favor of more people like Joseph coming into Egypt. And then verse 17 through 20, and Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Say unto thy brethren, This do ye, lade your beasts, and go, get you unto the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households, and come unto me, and I will give you the good of the land of Egypt, and ye shall eat the fat of the land. Now thou art commanded, this do ye. Take you wagons out of the land of Egypt for your little ones, and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Also regard not your stuff, for the good of all the land of Egypt is yours. We do not know exactly how Pharaoh and Joseph met to talk here, but more than likely the Pharaoh called Joseph to his house to speak to him. The Pharaoh speaks specifically to Joseph to say unto his brethren, This do ye. In essence, the Pharaoh is commanding that Joseph bring his father and all the households that pertain to him back to him. Why would the Pharaoh bring foreigners into Egypt, especially during a time of famine? It is because of Joseph. The Pharaoh would have made judgments on Joseph's family based on the sort of person Joseph was. What the Pharaoh thought of Joseph goes back to chapter 41. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is. Genesis chapter 41, verse 38. Joseph did not have to preach or lead a prayer meeting for the Pharaoh to see the Spirit of God was in him. He could see it in Joseph's character, and Joseph's knowledge and his wisdom and humility. All of Egypt has survived because of Joseph, and in his dealings with the people of Egypt, Joseph has shown himself as a man of honor. The application is this, is that the presence and the power of the Spirit of God can be seen in practical ways, not just in the ways we think the Spirit of God should show up. The Pharaoh tells Joseph to take wagons and load your beasts with enough supplies and food to get them to Canaan, and enough of them to pick up all that belongs to Jacob and Joseph's extended family. The Pharaoh is commanding Joseph to tell his brethren to return, and he would give them the good of the land of Egypt. The Pharaoh is so pleased with Joseph, he will give some of the choicest land of Egypt. Remember, Joseph accused his brethren as spies in the beginning. This was not just a ruse by Joseph. There was concern in Egypt about this very thing. No one just walked into Egypt. They enforced what we would call immigration laws. Since Joseph proved to be beneficial to Egypt, it was assumed by the Pharaoh Joseph's family would be as well. In other words, it was only by the proper channel, which is the Pharaoh, they were to gain entrance into the country permanently. Immigration laws are not something in recent times. They were in ancient times. And then in verses 21 through 23, and the children of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons, according to the commandment of Pharaoh, and gave them provision for the way. To all of them he gave each man changes of raiment, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of raiment. And to his father he sent after this manner: 10 asses laden with the good things of Egypt, and 10 she-asses laden with corn and bread and meat for his father by the way. The sons of Jacob or Israel did as Joseph told them. What follows are the things which were done on behalf of Joseph's brethren. The wagons given were by the command of Pharaoh. It is Pharaoh, the authority of Egypt, who commands Joseph to bring his extended family to live in Egypt. It is God whose hand is in all of this. It has nothing to do with coincidence. Joseph's brethren did as Pharaoh commanded. Joseph provides his brothers with changes of raiment or new clothing. Just this one action shows that Joseph's heart is a forgiving heart. His brothers had taken the coat of many colors from him and left him for dead. But now Joseph shows them grace. For his full brother Benjamin, he gives 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of raiment, for a sign of his love and favor. All of these gifts are also an evidence to Jacob in how rich and powerful his brethren will describe him to be. Joseph also adds gifts for his father: 10 donkeys loaded with good gifts from Egypt, and 10 donkeys loaded with provisions. And then in verse 24, so he sent his brethren away, and they departed. And he said unto them, see that ye fall not out by the way. Joseph sends them away. The word see that ye fall not out by the way shows Joseph knew the relationship his brothers had with one another. He understood they could argue with each other about going back to Egypt. They could argue about if telling Jacob was the right thing to do. Who was to blame for selling Joseph in the first place? Why should Benjamin get the most gifts? That was not fair to them. The potential to fall out of the way is a reality here. Nevertheless, they did return back to Jacob and told him about Joseph and what was told them to say. They left the decision to Jacob, their father. In all of this, the brothers are fulfilling God's plan for the world. All they knew was to move to Egypt meant salvation from starvation. But for their future descendants, it would mean centuries of slavery in Egypt. Even if they had known the famine would have forced them out of the land of Canaan. Did they know about God's prophecy given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 and 14? We do not know, but we know Moses knew about this prophecy 400 years later. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. Jacob was aware of the prophecy, though. We can gather this in the first few verses when you read in chapter 46. Jacob went to Egypt after God reassured him not to fear, for he would make them a great nation. The moving of Jacob and his sons' families is the beginning of the prophecy in Genesis chapter 15. And then in verses 25 and 26, and they went up out of Egypt and came into the land of Canaan unto Jacob their father, and told him, saying, Joseph is yet alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart fainted, for he believed them not. The brothers went up out of Egypt and came to Canaan. The brothers told Jacob that Joseph was alive and that he was a governor over all of Egypt. Jacob's heart fainted when he was told this, for he believed them not. Now we can only imagine the emotions that ran through Jacob at this very moment. It has been years since he had lost Joseph and thought that he was dead. Now he is told he is alive, and that all the mourning he had for Joseph was because of a lie. Not only that, but he is also told Joseph is a governor over all the land of Egypt. It would have been a shock to him, I'm sure, but he believed them not. Why did he not believe it? It could have been he had been lied to many times by his sons. Maybe he found it so incredible he could not believe it. Whatever the case, he believes here in the next two verses, verses 27 and 28. And they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said unto them. And when he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die. Then Jacob hears the words that Joseph had spoken to the brothers, and he sees the wagons that Joseph had sent, and he believes. Once Jacob saw the wagons and heard all that Joseph had said, his spirit was revived. Apparently, seeing the wagons was more convincing than simply the words of his sons. What his sons were saying now makes sense to him. Where would all these wagons, donkeys, gifts, and supplies come from? And then in verse 28, we are told that Israel, not Jacob, but Israel, says it's enough. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die. This testimony of faith came from Israel, not Jacob. It is not the old Jacob that had the testimony. It is Israel, the man that God conquered, that has this testimony. It is Israel who is being asked by his son, Joseph, to leave the land of promise. Israel is being asked in his old age to leave the land that was promised through Abraham, his grandfather. It is in faith Israel undertakes a very difficult journey at his age. He does it in all probability, for he is reminded of the revelation of God in the dreams of Joseph as a young man. Israel has heard the words of his son Joseph, and he has seen God's providence in all of these events. Thereby he will pick up and journey to see his son. The narrative of Joseph in Genesis is not only a story of Joseph as a deliverer. It is a story of a man, Joseph, who remained wholly dependent on God. A man who did not let prosperity and success go to his head. He kept the dreams alive that God had given him by serving others and staying faithful to God. Joseph believed God was going to fulfill those dreams. He held on to them. He did not know how or when, but he knew God was going to use him as long as he remained trusting in God. My allergies. I'm sorry. But I hope you got something out of the lesson. I had to kind of rush through it. I got behind. But it's a good study to read about Joseph and compare it to Christ. There's a lot there. And there's some, I think, on the outline I gave you, and that's just some. There's many, many things that you can see in there. But Brother Phil, would you dismiss us from Sunday school, please? Thank you, Brother Phil.